Nothing makes believers more uncomfortable than this question. What if you did everything right, and God still let everything fall apart? No hidden sin, no moral failure, no secret rebellion. You prayed, you obeyed, you stayed faithful, and still you lost it. Your peace, your health, your security, your sense that God was fair. Here's the part no one wants to say out loud. Some of the most righteous people in the Bible suffered the most, and God never rushed to explain himself. Sit with that for a second. Because if suffering automatically meant punishment, then obedience would be insurance. But the Bible destroys that idea. And if you're honest, this question isn't theological for you. It's personal. In this video, you're not going to get a comfortable answer. You're going to get a biblical truth most churches avoid because it breaks transactional faith. You'll discover why the Bible openly shows righteous people suffering without calling them guilty. Why God rebukes religious explanations instead of defending them. Why suffering is not always a lesson, a warning, or a correction, but sometimes a confrontation. And most importantly, how to keep your faith when obedience doesn't protect you and prayer doesn't fix the pain. This is not a message for people who want quick answers. This is for people who want a faith that survives reality. Stay with me, because what Scripture actually says about suffering will either offend you or free you. The crisis does not begin with suffering. It begins with confusion. Because suffering is not what breaks faith, unexpected suffering does. The Bible presents a figure who embodies this tension perfectly. Someone described as righteous, upright, faithful, and blameless. Not perfect, but sincere. Not sinless, but honest. A person who feared God, avoided evil, and lived with integrity in public and private life. And then everything collapses. Not gradually, not symbolically, but violently and all at once. Loss follows loss. Stability disappears. Security evaporates. What took years to build vanishes in moments. And what makes this crisis unbearable is not the pain itself, it's the lack of moral explanation. There is no warning, no accusation, no rebuke from God. From the human perspective, this makes no sense. Because we are taught explicitly or subtly that suffering is connected to wrongdoing, that pain is corrective, that loss is instructional, that hardship must be deserved. But the biblical narrative refuses to cooperate with that framework. The righteous sufferer does not collapse into chaos immediately. He mourns, yes, but he does not curse God. He grieves, but he does not abandon faith. His first response is not rebellion, but disorientation. And that is the real crisis. What do you do when faith no longer explains your life? Because at this stage, the crisis is not theological, it's relational. The problem is not that God feels absent. The problem is that God feels silent. And silence is far more destabilizing than anger. Silence gives no direction. Silence gives no clarity. Silence forces waiting without answers. And this is where most people quietly panic, because silence removes control. It removes the ability to interpret events quickly. It removes the comfort of cause and effect logic. It removes the illusion that righteousness guarantees protection. The sufferer sits in this space, not knowing why, not knowing how long, not knowing what this means about God. And that uncertainty is more threatening than the loss itself. Then something else happens. Others arrive. Friends, observers, religious voices, people who cannot tolerate ambiguity, people who believe that suffering must be explained immediately because unexplained suffering threatens their worldview. They come with certainty. They come with theology. They come with answers. And this is where the crisis deepens. Because now the pain is not just physical or emotional. It becomes spiritualized, interpreted, framed, judged. The implication is subtle but devastating. If you are suffering, something must be wrong with you. And suddenly, the righteous sufferer is not just hurting, he is defending his integrity. This is the real crisis the Bible exposes. Not suffering itself, but suffering misunderstood. Because pain alone can be endured. But pain plus accusation fractures the soul. And at this point in the story, nothing has been resolved. No explanation has been given. No lesson has been revealed. Only this truth remains. Sometimes the most painful part of suffering is not what you lose, but what others assume about you while you're losing it. And that prepares the ground for the next confrontation. Most people make the same mistake when they encounter suffering, and it feels logical, even righteous. They assume that pain must always have a moral explanation. If someone is suffering, there must be a reason, a failure, a hidden sin, a bad decision God is correcting. This assumption feels safe because it preserves a sense of control. If suffering is always deserved, then obedience guarantees protection. But the Bible quietly dismantles this belief in ways most sermons avoid. The human mind craves cause and effect. We want life to operate like a moral vending machine. Do good, receive blessing. Do bad, receive punishment. This framework is comforting because it suggests that chaos is an illusion and God is predictable. Yet Scripture repeatedly shows that this is not how reality works. The problem is not that people believe God is just. It's that they reduce divine justice to something small enough to manage. One of the most dangerous spiritual errors is believing that righteousness is a shield against suffering. This belief creates two silent victims. First, the righteous sufferer who begins to question their worth when pain arrives. Second, the observer who feels justified in judging instead of comforting. The Bible exposes this mistake, not through abstract teaching, but through brutal narrative confrontation. Consider the friends of a righteous sufferer. They arrive with silence, which is wisdom. But the moment they speak, everything collapses. They assume suffering must be evidence. Evidence of hidden guilt. Evidence of divine displeasure. Evidence that God is correcting something. Their theology is neat, logical, and completely wrong. Here is the uncomfortable truth most believers miss. Bad theology often sounds reasonable. It quotes God, it defends God, it explains God, and yet it misrepresents Him entirely. Scripture records entire chapters of speeches that God later condemns, not because they were spoken by atheists or enemies, but because they were spoken by religious people who were certain they understood how God operates. They believed they were protecting God's justice, when in reality, they were accusing God of cruelty. This error still dominates modern faith culture. When someone suffers, we rush to assign meaning before offering presents. We ask why before we ask, how can I help? We search for lessons instead of wounds. We look for spiritual causes instead of human compassion. And we do this because unresolved suffering terrifies us. The Bible never teaches that all suffering is correction. Sometimes suffering is collision between a broken world and a faithful soul. Sometimes it is not a message. Sometimes it is not a test. Sometimes it is not punishment. Sometimes it is simply the cost of living righteously in a world that is misaligned with God. The common mistake is assuming that God's silence equals guilt. But Scripture shows something far more disturbing. Sometimes God is silent because no explanation would satisfy us. Not because the sufferer has failed, but because the mystery is larger than moral formulas. This mistake creates a dangerous spiritual feedback loop. The righteous sufferer begins to doubt God. The observer becomes self-righteous. And God's character is distorted into that of an accountant instead of a father. The Bible does not protect us from this discomfort. It forces us to sit in it. It preserves the tension. It refuses to resolve the pain quickly. And that refusal is intentional. Because the truth is not that God rewards the wicked and punishes the righteous. The truth is far more unsettling. God allows realities we cannot domesticate. And when we try to explain suffering too quickly, we often stand against God while thinking we speak for Him. This is why shallow explanations are spiritually violent. They minimize pain. They shame grief. They silence honest faith. And they push wounded people away from God, not because God rejected them, but because believers misrepresented Him. The common mistake is not doubt. The common mistake is certainty. And that mistake prepares us for the most uncomfortable truth of all. The uncomfortable truth is not that God sometimes allows suffering. Most believers can accept that. The uncomfortable truth is who God defends when suffering happens, and it is rarely who we expect. Scripture reveals something that quietly dismantles moral certainty. God does not side with explanations. He sides with honesty. He does not reward those who speak confidently about Him. He confronts those who speak incorrectly in His name. And the most shocking moment in this entire biblical narrative is not the suffering itself. It is God's verdict on the theology surrounding it. After pages of confident religious reasoning, God finally speaks. And when He does not praise the ones who defended His justice. He rebukes them, not gently, not indirectly, but explicitly. He declares that their words were wrong, while affirming the integrity of the one who dared to speak from pain instead of certainty. This is where most believers feel deeply unsettled, because the righteous sufferer did not speak politely. He questioned, he protested, he lamented. He expressed confusion, anger, and grief. And yet God says, He spoke rightly about me, not because His words were theologically precise, but because they were honest. This destroys the idea that faith is measured by calm explanations. The Bible reveals that faith is measured by relational honesty, not emotional control. God is not offended by pain-filled questions. He is offended by confident misrepresentations of his character. Here is the truth most people are never taught. God prefers wounded honesty over polished theology. This means something terrifying for religious culture. It means that silence can be holy, but explanations can be sinful. It means defending God incorrectly is worse than questioning him sincerely. It means you can quote scripture and still stand opposed to God's heart. The uncomfortable truth is that suffering exposes theology. Pain does not create belief, it reveals it. It reveals whether you believe God is a formula or a person, whether you believe he is safe or merely predictable, whether you trust him enough to speak honestly or only when you understand. God never explains the suffering in detail. That alone is devastating. He does not answer the why the way humans demand. Instead, he reveals the who, not as a tyrant, not as an accountant, but as a presence too vast to be reduced to cause and effect logic. And this is the truth that fractures shallow faith. God is not obligated to be understandable in order to be good. This truth does not comfort the mind, it confronts it. Because it removes control, it dismantles transactional faith. It destroys the illusion that righteousness is insurance against pain. The Bible teaches that righteousness does not exempt you from suffering. It often exposes you to it. Not because God is unjust, but because goodness is disruptive in a broken world. Light irritates darkness. Integrity provokes resistance. Truth attracts opposition. And here is the final blow to simplistic theology. God never says the suffering was deserved. He never blames the righteous sufferer. He never validates the accusations. He restores, but without explaining. This tells us something crucial. Restoration is not proof that suffering had a moral cause. Restoration is proof that God is not finished. The uncomfortable truth is that some suffering is not a lesson, it is a location. A place where faith is stripped of illusions, where God is encountered without explanations, where trust survives without answers. And most people don't want that God. They want a God they can predict, a God they can manage, a God they can explain. But the Bible reveals a God who cannot be domesticated, only trusted. And that truth prepares us for the most personal confrontation of all. This is the moment where the story stops being biblical history and becomes a mirror. Because the real question is not why righteous people suffer. The real question is what suffering reveals about you when it arrives. Most people believe they trust God until he stops behaving the way they expect, until obedience does not produce protection, until prayer does not produce relief, until faith does not produce clarity, and that is where illusion collapses. Here is the uncomfortable personal truth. Many people do not trust God. They trust outcomes. They trust that if they do the right things, life will cooperate, that morality will function like leverage, that faith is a mechanism to control uncertainty. And when suffering breaks that contract, faith feels betrayed, not because God changed, but because expectations were never aligned with reality. Suffering exposes what kind of relationship you actually have with God, a transactional one or a relational one. A transactional faith says, I obey, therefore you protect. A relational faith says, even if I don't understand, I will not walk away. The Bible never promises that God will always be explainable. It promises that He will be present. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because presence demands trust, explanations only demand logic. Here is where many believers quietly fail, not by sinning, but by withdrawing, by going silent, by pulling back emotionally, by continuing religious activity while disengaging relationally, by praying without honesty, worshiping without vulnerability, believing without intimacy. But Scripture reveals something radical. God invites confrontation, not distance. He invites lament, protest, tears, confusion. He invites you to speak what you feel instead of pretending what you don't, because silence born of fear is not reverence, it is avoidance. The application is this: if you are suffering right now, the goal is not to sound faithful. The goal is to stay relational. You are allowed to say you don't understand. You are allowed to say this hurts. You are allowed to say you feel abandoned, even if you are not. What you are not invited to do is pretend. Pretending protects your image, not your soul. And here is the personal challenge most people avoid. Stop asking why this is happening and ask what this suffering is revealing. Is it revealing control issues? Is it revealing conditional trust? Is it revealing theology borrowed instead of lived? Is it revealing a God you believed in but never truly knew? Suffering strips away borrowed beliefs. It leaves only what is real. And the terrifying thing is this: you can lose explanations and still keep God. But if your faith depends on explanations, you will lose both. This is not about becoming stronger. It is about becoming honest. Because the deepest form of faith is not certainty. It is refusal to walk away when certainty dies. And that leads us to the final confrontation. At the end of the story, something unsettling remains. There is restoration, but not explanation. There is healing, but not closure. There is presence, but not certainty. And that is intentional, because the Bible does not end this narrative by teaching us why the suffering happened. It ends by teaching us who is still standing when the suffering ends. God never turns suffering into a formula. He never says, here is how to avoid this next time. He never reduces pain into a lesson you can package and control. Instead, He reveals Himself not as an answer, but as a reality. And that is the final confrontation. Do you want answers, or do you want God? Because there will be moments in your life where you cannot have both. Moments where faith will no longer feel safe. Moments where obedience will feel unrewarded. Moments where prayer will feel unanswered. Moments where silence will feel louder than comfort. And in those moments, faith stops being theoretical. This is where shallow belief collapses, but deep trust begins. The Bible never promises that righteous people will be spared suffering. It promises that suffering will not have the final word. Not because it makes sense, but because God is still present when sense disappears. And here's the truth most people don't want to hear. If your faith only works when life works, it will not survive reality. But if your faith is rooted in relationship, not outcomes, it will survive even when explanations die. So here is the quiet invitation, not a command. If you are suffering right now, do not rush to fix it. Do not rush to explain it. Do not rush to spiritualize it. Stay honest, stay relational, stay present. God is not asking you to understand Him. He is asking you to trust Him without pretending. And that kind of faith, raw, unpolished, wounded, is the kind Scripture says God calls right. If this message unsettled you, that's not accidental. Truth usually does. Leave a comment. Have you ever felt faithful and still abandoned? Save this video if you're walking through something you can't explain yet. Subscribe if you want biblical truth that doesn't comfort your illusions, but strengthens your faith. Because the Bible was never meant to give you control. It was meant to teach you trust. And trust always begins where answers end.